Evening, everyone. My name is Noel Healy, and I'm a professor in the Geography and Sustainability Department here at Salem State University. I'm also joined by Joey Walingovich, founder of Sunrise Salem and Geography and Sustainability major at Salem State. Towards the end of the webinar, Joey will be fielding any questions from our live viewers. So audience members can submit your questions via the Q&A box below. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our special guest. Today we're delighted to welcome Boston Globe climate producer Dharna Noor to Salem State's Earth Week Climate Lecture Series. Dharna is the Boston Globe's climate producer. Prior to joining the Boston Globe's climate team, Dharna worked as a staff writer with Earther, which is Gizmodo's Climate Vertical, where she also co-produced a season of the podcast Drilled, which is one of my favorite podcast folks to check out. And this episodes of season, she looked at the fossil fuels' influence on education, which is something hopefully we'll get to chat a little bit about today. Before that, she led the climate team at the Real News Network, and her writing has also appeared in publications including In These Times, Jacobin Magazine, and Truth Out. She's also been interviewed in podcasts and radio programs such as Times Radio, Vox Tell Me More, The Insurgents, and NPR's Living on Earth. Dharna has quickly garnered a stellar reputation as a critical climate and energy journalist in the US, and we're really looking forward to today's conversation. Welcome, Dharna.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that very kind introduction, Noel. It's awesome to be here.
Yeah, so yeah, it's great to meet you, Dharna. I've been a fan of your work with a while, and we were all really delighted to see you starting at the Globe. When I said we, a lot of the climate and energy justice folk. Climate is a challenging topic. We'll try and start off with something a little bit light. Maybe if you'd like to share what was your most fun climate reporting assignment to date. Have you ever covered something that was unusually uplifting or entertaining, if that exists in the climate world?
Yeah, I mean, you're right to say it's kind of a hard question because so much of the work that we do, as you well know, in this sort of space is so grim. But yes, definitely, I've had the opportunity to do lots of really uplifting reporting. And also some really fun reporting, including, I wrote a piece from the perspective of a jellyfish one time, all sorts of weird stuff. But honestly, I think that maybe the most fun that I've ever had in my reporting was when I reported on Mike Rowe last year. Mike Rowe is the host of the program Dirty Jobs, but he started a new TV show last year that was on Discovery Plus. That basically I found was funded by, well, I didn't even find, he openly in the show says it was funded by the oil lobby, by the American Petroleum Institute, which is, if you don't know, the biggest industry lobbying group, the biggest fossil fuel industry lobbying group in the United States. And, this is not his only tie to the fossil fuel industry. His foundation, which is sort of very obviously anti-union, anti-worker, pro-boss, pro-fossil fuels, also takes money from the oil industry. I wrote a pretty snarky piece about this and he responded in an extremely condescending way and we got into a bit of a back and forth. And so that was probably the most entertaining reporting that I've done on the beat. But that's not to say, I mean, yes, lots of incredible solutions happening out there and lots of really, really good news to report on too.
Yeah, and I guess working on the solution stuff is always fun. And we'll talk a little bit later about the Green New Deal, which is something that brings some hope and excitement, particularly with me and when I'm talking with my students as well. What do you think your most important piece of journalism has been thus far? So this could be something that garnered a lot of attention or something which you deem as important.
So such a hard question. I mean, I think that as a journalist, sometimes the struggle is knowing that the sort of effects that your work can have are sometimes so limited by the very things that you're reporting on. You'll report on like the failures of an administration or a policy or something, and then those exact failures will mean that no action is taken on the thing that you are reporting on. But one of the things that I think has been really rewarding for me and important for me in my own work has been sort of looking at the most inconvenient parts of the struggle to, slow climate change and transition to renewables. And I think one of the most important stories that I've done on this beat was about a project called the Texas Climate Jobs Program, a project which is in Texas that was led by Texas's AFL-CIO, a massive coalition of unions. It was a really jobs first kind of climate program to speed the energy transition in obviously a state that is, where the economy is so heavily fueled by fossil fuels, no pun intended. And I think that that was a really important story, not only because it sort of got some attention and got, some workers in other places sort of excited seemingly about the possibility of a jobs first climate sort of plan. But also for me, I think that that was a really important story because it really showed me so much about how much there is to be missed when we think of climate plans as only about, shutting down a coal plant, shutting down an oil rig, and not about building the jobs of the future in a way that's really sustainable and, actually can foster a better world than the one that we have now in so many ways. I know that we'll talk a little bit about the Green New Deal later, but this is speaking from me, not from the Boston Globe, obviously, and my opinions are just mine. But I think this is a really important shift that sort of happened in the climate movement generally. This focus on, moving away from an austerity framework and towards talking about what fighting climate change can do for people to improve people's lives. And that was a really clear example of that.
Yeah, and Labour just plays such an important role within the climate movement, and this has been really emphasised by the rise of the Green New Deal. So you mentioned some of the kind of the gaps or some of the kind of missing stories around climate. What do you think are perhaps the biggest successes and the biggest gaps in climate news reporting at the moment?
Great question. I mean, I have been on this beat for a relatively short time. And I think even in the, 5 or so years that I've been focusing on climate, around 10 that I've been in the media space, there's been just an explosion of climate reporting. And that in itself, I think, is a success. I mean, the fact that we have climate stories on the front pages of big papers with some regularity, the fact that there is more coverage of things like, major UN climate reports is a huge success. That said, I think that the media has a really, really long way to go to actually treat the issue at the scale that it deserves, so to speak. And I think that, part of what we can really do better as journalists is to sort of examine the more unsavory actors who might be profiting off of the solutions that we need, some of the more inconvenient aspects of what the climate fight might mean. For instance, I've been really heartened lately to see a little bit more focus on the environmental justice impacts of mining for rare earth minerals that we need in order to transition to, more renewable energy, especially things like solar and battery power and things like this. And so I think that more reporting that can sort of examine those environmental justice impacts of even transitioning to clean energy will be really, really important in the future.
That's a great point. And, this is where the concept of a just transition comes in. You raise an important point there, and it gets me thinking about media business models and the need to generate ad revenues. So breaking news often tends to muscle out important climate news stories, even when, the IPCC and stuff comes around. And how can climate reporting compete with this so-called tyranny of the immediate and all these competing news cycles? Is it possible, or have you any thoughts on how how we can keep the climate crisis up front and center?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that my thinking on this has sort of changed in the past few years. I began my career in very scrappy, sort of openly socialist, kind of independent media, nonprofit media. And now I'm a producer at the Boston Globe, obviously, a storied and major newspaper in this region. And I've really found that people's appetite for climate stories, even in places where, they might seem to be unlikely, is just so high. I mean, we've had top charting stories in a mainstream global newspaper so frequently. And I think that, I think a lot of the reason that there's been this misconception that climate stories have to be boring or aren't of interest to people the way that like pop culture stories and things are is because we've seen climate change for so long as something that's in a silo. But like there's no reason that a climate story should ever have to be boring. This is something that's reshaping the very fundamental fabric of human society. It's something that's reshaping every facet of human life as we speak, and I think that when you can make those connections and really remind everyone that this is a story about them, not just somebody else, not just not just someone who's maybe across the ocean from you, but a story about you right now. Yes, you reader, that can really make a huge difference. But yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say that it's never disheartening to see like just story after story that ignores really obvious climate impacts charting in major papers or on CNN or whatever. But I do think that we need to bear some responsibility as journalists for making it that way. And part of the way that you get people to read your stories is you make them good, interesting, and feel relevant. And so I think that there's a lot that we can do on that front.
And I think the Green New Deal is something that has captivated readers' interest for various reasons over the last probably year or more. And just in case some of our audience members aren't familiar, so the Green New Deal is a 10-year economic mobilization plan that plans to rapidly transition the US to a zero carbon economy, while at the same time significantly reducing inequality and redressing legacies of systematic oppression. So the Green New Deal has generated a lot of excitement amongst climate and energy justice communities. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts more just on how the emergence of this new policy framework, this new policy paradigm has changed the climate debate or changed maybe how readers view this issue or general public.
Again, speaking for me, not speaking for the Boston Globe, it's been really interesting to see the way that conversations nationally have completely shifted, I think, just in, again, the past 4-ish years since the Green New Deal sort of reshaped the conversation, came on the stage in a major way. And I think that one way, as we sort of talked about earlier, that this has happened is that people are starting to learn that climate policies don't have to be about not having something. It doesn't have to be about having to pay more for gas. It doesn't have to mean, paying higher heat bills or, paying in some way for the transition to green energy. It doesn't mean that you have to stop eating, the things that you love the most. I mean, in some ways, of course, we'll all have to make some kinds of sacrifices. The world will need to go through these fundamental shifts. But there are also so many ways that our lives can be so much better if we address the climate crisis. I mean, the Green New Deal, I think, has really put on people's radar that, like, yeah, it would actually be better to not have to drive to work every day. It would actually be better to have free public transit. It would be better if we had jobs that we knew were not going to go away as the energy transition happens. And, I don't think that means that any of these transitions will be easy. Obviously, in this political climate, there's no way that they will be easy. But I think that it's really, really important to have some perspective and to have political ambition, to remember what exactly it is that we're fighting for. And remember that people are at the heart of that, right? It's not that the climate crisis is something that we have to address as we address other things, or that we have to address the climate crisis to save the planet at our own expense. We are such an integral part of what we are trying to save.
It's really interesting. And myself and Fergus Green actually have a new paper coming out, which documents how inequality actually fuels climate emissions. So there's a moral reason to address systematic racism and inequalities, but there's also a climate reason, which is also really interesting.
I would love to hear more about that.
It's coming out the end of the month. We'll certainly share it with you then. So in Boston at the moment, it's pretty exciting because we have a Green New Dealer as mayor. So Boston Mayor Michelle Wu, she was elected November 2021 on the back of a highly detailed Green New Deal platform. And her Green New Deal proposal is arguably one of the strongest at the city level of Green New Deals across the US. what is it like reporting in a city that has this type of new energy around a city level Green New Deal? And maybe if you'd like to share some thoughts on reporting and on different elements of our Green New Deal proposal.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to come into the Globe's new climate bureau as Mayor Wu came into office. I mean, obviously, we don't endorse candidates or anything like that, but I will say that it does seem that the conversation has really shifted even since she came into office pretty recently. It's also been really interesting to see the sort of barriers that she's facing in the agenda that she's trying to set. You know, the ways that just having a new mayor doesn't, for instance, all of a sudden change how the Department of Public Utilities works, or, you know, how much of a role utility companies have in shaping the energy transition and things like this. So definitely, I mean, I think that having a city in the United States where there's such a high level of ambition, and especially such a high level of focus on inequality, racial inequality, class inequality, and in a city, obviously, that's, you know, not only sort of seen as a climate leader, but also is in many ways on the forefront of so many different kinds of climate changes, whether that's sea level rise or heat islands and things like this, has been pretty cool. Again, though, I do think that it will be important to sort of hold anyone to account as they aim to implement these kind of bold agendas.
And yeah, and that kind of brings us on to the kind of broader issue around the need for, you know, seismic changes to tackle climate crisis. And climate journalism can play a really important role in drawing attention to these transformative actions, the systematic change, the structural power shifts that are needed to phase out fossil fuels. And limiting climate chaos necessitates radical actions. But maybe historically, the New York Times and Washington Post and even the Globe were not where these voices were, you know, traditionally given a platform. And it's generally more independent media, whether it's Democracy Now!, Jacobin Magazine, Truth Out, etc., which truly pushes back against the status quo and discusses solutions which perhaps don't align with continued economic growth or continued militarism, or moves beyond this preoccupation with market-based solutions. Do you think that editors in major newsrooms will ever give, you know, frequent airtime to these so-called radical stories and voices, or is there anything changing in this regard?
So often, I think that editors at papers, I think that media in general takes cues from, you know, sort of elite, so to speak, voices. And I think that those voices are in some ways changing. I mean, obviously, the role of a corporation is to make money, and that is not going to change. But there are, I mean, the fact that, for instance, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said recently that, you know, it's actually what is radical and you know, essentially destructive is for companies to continue to grow the fossil fuel economy, whereas, you know, climate activists are painted as radicals. I think that that shows a pretty major shift, and one that has been reflected in newsrooms. I mean, my own personal views, I think, I have much more of an interest in public sector solutions, and much more of an interest in sort of uplifting justice. But I do think that, I mean, I would love to see papers of record. I would love to see major sort of mainstream media take on these debates more often. I mean, I don't think, of course, that like all of a sudden the New York Times is going to turn into Jacobin Magazine or something like this. But I think that one thing I would like to see more of, and I think one thing that we are seeing more of, frankly, is, you know, room for a kind of debate in the pages of these papers and these kinds of magazines. I mean, I think sometimes, you know, it's important to remember that one can strengthen their argument by, you know, just engaging with the sort of mainstream argument that they're fighting against. It's one thing to ignore that argument altogether. It's another one to sort of take it on head on and get in the ring and sort of say, this is why you are wrong, and this is why my sort of line of reasoning is better for you, or makes more sense, or like aligns with the science better, or whatever. So I hope to see more debate, and I do think that there has been a little bit more of that in recent years.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And as I said, the climate and energy community were delighted when you joined the Boston Globe. Some of the Boston Globe's coverage, seems to focus a lot on business and technical innovations, and this is, fairly consistent with other major news outlets. But the recent IPCC report made it clear we also need to think about shifting global consumption patterns, and the issue of global consumption patterns doesn't sometimes get enough attention. Do you see this as part of something that the Globe, could address, or how, where does the Globe sit on this issue?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I mean, I think that there's sort of two different points here, right? One is the question of green growth versus degrowth. And the other is this sort of emphasis on market-based corporate solutions. Obviously, these two things are intimately related. I mean, I think that media in general, including sort of major media, is learning a lot and is changing very rapidly. I mean, I came on to the Globe's climate team just 6 months ago. The climate desk just launched 5 months ago or so. And so obviously, I mean, I think that we all know that that there's a lot that can be improved and a lot that we can just frankly do more of. I mean, in terms of whether or not I think that the sort of corporate media, mainstream media, whatever you want to call it, will take a stance that goes against growth, I mean, I think that what I would be looking for again is, sort of at least lifting up other opinions, dissenting opinions. And I feel sort of similarly about the focus on technological solutions, market-based solutions, and things like this. I mean, I think that it would be, do I think that there's going to all of a sudden be a shift away from techno-optimism? No, I don't. But do I think that there could be more room in the pages of these papers for, discussions of more sort of publicly owned renewable energy, or, like solutions that prioritize people over profit? Yeah, I definitely do. And I think that there's a change that the science shows needs to happen. I mean, I think that even like if you look at the most recent IPCC report versus the one before that, the emphasis on market-based solutions has dramatically dropped. I mean, there's still some, but I think that the emphasis has dramatically dropped. And I think that as the science shows that market-based solutions often don't really seem to pan out in terms of like evidence showing that they're working, yeah, journalists, I think, will kind of see that too. Obviously, part of the issue is the funding models of newspapers. I think that it's really important to make sure that what journalists are able to write are not compromised by the funders of newspapers. And I think that's also a place where there's a lot of sort of innovation happening. I'm really excited to see the rise of so much independent media too.
That's really interesting. And that kind of brings us on to another aligned kind of tricky issue to write about, is the issue of responsibility. Responsibility for the climate crisis. BP, British Petroleum, invented the phrase carbon footprint, along with this carbon calculator in 2004 as a means to shift blame away from fossil fuel companies. But the IPCC also highlights the need for degrowth. How do you best navigate this challenge around writing about the issue of responsibility? On the one hand, the need for individual actions, while at the same time clarifying, the importance of collective actions, or like political organizing for mass transit, for example.
I think one thing that I've sort of learned can garner responses from people other than just sort of shutting down is keeping in mind that so many people do want to make individual changes, and that those changes are simply not easy to make. I mean, this dichotomy, I think, of like individual versus collective action is in some ways sort of false, because what are the things that shape individual action? They are government action, they're collective action, right? And so the things that can sort of set the stage for people to make better actions, I think, are often what we need to focus on. It's one thing to sort of say, oh, people aren't choosing to drive electric cars. Okay, well, why? Often they're way more expensive. Also, federal rebates and state rebates here in Massachusetts don't apply to used cars. Also, there's not enough chargers. Also people don't really know always how to navigate the system of buying an electric car, how to navigate rebate programs, even where to buy or charge their electric vehicles. I think that that's a really important, those are all really important reasons that kind of shape the individual choices that people are making. Similarly, do people want to take public transit? I don't know. They would certainly want to take public transit a lot more if it were better, if it were better funded, if it were cheaper, if it were easier to take, if it were more convenient. And I think that setting the stage for people to make really good choices can be really important. Obviously, I think that policy needs to shape a world that is better for people. Do I think that that means all of a sudden everyone is going to start making super climate friendly choices? No. But I'm more interested, I guess, in what the majority of people are doing. And frankly, I would love to live in a world where it's just more convenient, cheaper, a better idea for non-climate reasons for people to behave in ways that are more environmentally friendly, quote unquote. I want climate deniers to also want to take public transit because it's just a better idea. I want the sort of stage to be set for people to make better choices because it's simply easier and cheaper to do so.
That's an excellent point. It reminds me when I lived in Munich on my sabbatical for 6 months, I only got in a car once, just because the public transportation system is just so efficient. So you did some work with the Drilled podcast, one of my favorite podcasts, and like the tobacco industry, the fossil fuel industry have engaged in what some writers have coined the invisible colonization of academia via corporate capture of academic research. And this can often shift the focus of solutions away from actions which challenge the business model of fossil fuel companies. So I would love to hear more about your work with the Drilled podcast, your view on podcasts as effective mediums, and more about your thoughts on fossil fuel industry's influence within education at any level.
Yeah, to take your second question first, the role that podcasts can have. I worked on only one season of the Drilled podcast, but you asked earlier about how climate coverage can sort of compete with the big sort of celebrity stories of the day, the big pop culture stories of the day. And I think that Drilled is a pretty great example of how they can. I mean, it's so clear now that Amy Westervelt has made the Drilled podcast that climate change is a true crime story. But it took the podcast, I think, to really put it in that kind of light, to really shed perspective on that aspect of the story. And so I think that, more narrative podcasts, more narrative stories, more storytelling in general on the climate beat can be really, really useful. We wanted to focus on the role that the fossil fuel industry has in shaping education, and specifically, sort of humanities and social sciences. I think a lot more has been sort of written previously about science education and climate education specifically, because we thought that it was a really sort of untold role that the fossil fuel industry was having on shaping public discourse and public opinion. We were kind of working on this podcast at a time when the divestment movement was really center stage for so much university and college organizing. And we were finding that even as so many schools were divesting, they were continuing to take funding from the fossil fuel industry to fund things like economics departments or humanities departments and things like this. And Boston is no stranger, right, to these kind of elite universities that continue to do this. I mean, the work of scholars like Ben Franta, Jeffrey Supran has shown that Harvard, MIT, these kinds of major and highly respected universities are as guilty of this as anybody. And I mean, colleges and universities are such an important part of the climate story, because where is it that climate research is coming from? Who shapes so much of the research that's going into reports like the IPCC report? I mean, it's major schools that are often taking funding from the oil and gas companies that we know cannot continue to exist if we're going to take the climate crisis seriously. So, an interesting sort of time to be working on this right now. And I'd love to hear, I guess, from anybody at Salem State who's working on this issue as well.
Yeah, the one we've done lots of good things at Salem State, but one that we're most proud of is, Salem State divested from fossil fuels
Absolutely.
a few years ago now, 5 or 6 years ago, I think, and that was something that we viewed as very important in the ecosystem of actions that we're doing around climate. I'd be interested to know if you have any insights on how the fossil fuel industry directly tries to influence climate narrative within media circles. I guess they're tangentially doing this in all spheres, but if you've got any insights to how they are trying to influence media, either via direct press releases or op-eds or things like this.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it really is completely direct. Again, as work done by scholars like Jeffrey Supran and Naomi Oreskes has shown, the number of just straight up editorials from the oil and gas lobby or oil and gas companies themselves in the pages of major newspapers is just absurd. You have to look no further than the front page ads and editorials that are taken out from time to time to really see what that influence means. But I think that this rears its head in other ways, right, too. I mean, I think that the sort of rise of sponsored content can make a lot of different kind of opportunities for these sorts of unsavory alliances. I think that there's been some really important work done recently on the ways that the fossil fuel industry is shaping its advertisements and media narratives for podcasts, because podcast ads are simply less regulated than ads in other sort of mediums. And so I think that, I mean, yes, there is a huge influence there. One way that I think that we can ensure that we're still able to do good work in media is to enforce that firewall rather, between advertisers and journalists. But the other way, obviously, is to foster more independent media. And I think that that's something that a lot of folks are working on right now.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the fossil fuel industry have their tentacles everywhere. So this brings on to a new subject when thinking about impacts of climate change in the global south. So climate change disproportionately impacts or affects the most vulnerable populations in the world, particularly those in the global south, yet their stories are rarely heard or they're given less emphasis. What can the media do to amplify these voices and stories, and is there an appetite for climate justice stories which extend beyond the borders of the US?
There has to be an appetite for it. I mean, there's some evidence that shows rather depressingly that people are more interested in the issues that affect their own lives and are really disinterested in climate issues that face other parts of the world. But I mean, when it comes down to it, like, in not too long, every zone is going to be a frontline zone, right? In not too long, all of us are going to be on the front lines, perhaps with the exception for a while of the extremely rich, of those who own the most capital. But that's not most of the people who are writing for, right? Most people are not the sort of corporate overlords of the world. So I mean, is there an appetite? There has to be. I mean, I think that part of the reason that we have to write these stories is to foster that appetite, and not in a way that sort of puts the global south in a vacuum, but also, showing the connections between climate impacts on the global south and here. In some ways, I think that the reason that people should care about what's happening in the global south is not merely out of altruism, but because the hurricanes and the floods that face places like Latin America and Bangladesh and Africa today are the ones that will face us tomorrow here in the global north. And obviously, this is not to say that there are not places that are on the front line here in the global north as well. I mean, there are tons of environmental justice communities in the United States that are also not honestly getting the kind of coverage that they deserve. But we need to, I think, remember that just because we're not on the front lines of something today doesn't mean that we're safe.
Yeah, that's really important. I have a selfish question. How do you write so fast? Because I remember when you interviewed me for the paper on how you pay for the Green New Deal, we had an email exchange, and in an hour you had the story up, and I was like, how did you do this? Academics, well, certainly me, I'm a slow writer, but we'll have some people tuning in who are interested in climate journalism or writing in general, have you got any tips on how you or other journalists, write fast?
It's such a good question. I mean, I have to say that there's always more to be said, right? Part of the way that you write fast is that you just remember that there's going to be another story tomorrow. And so not trying to fit everything into every story that you write can be really important. And also sometimes it's honestly really heartbreaking. I mean, there's so many times, like every week I write a story and I'll think, oh, this isn't even getting to this other really important part of this topic that I'm writing about. And I'll just have to be okay with that and try to address it in the story that I write the next week. I think that one really important way to sort of learn to write faster is to have a beat and to really foster it. Having sources, having regular conversations with people like you, or with organizers, or folks who are directly affected by things like hurricanes and floods and heat waves. Knowing who to talk to before you even know what the story is, like knowing when a heat wave happens that you can call this scientist, this organizer in this place, and this policymaker can be a really important way to get things done quickly. But honestly, this is something that I feel that I'm still working on every day. I think that we're always told that we need to write more, better, faster. And sometimes I don't think that we can do all of those things. Sometimes I really think that it's actually important for journalists, especially journalists on a beat as important as the climate beat, to take a beat, slow down, think more about the implications of what's being written. So that's not to say that getting the news out there quickly is not important, but also speed is not always the most important thing.
And do you view long form journalism as being an important part of the climate reporting as well, or?
Yes, absolutely. And not only, I mean, long form journalism, op-eds, analysis, I think that all of these sorts of, from short little blogs to like tomes, books the size of the Bible, I think there's a place for all of these things. I mean, and the reason is because climate change is deeply embedded into every story, is something that people need to be hearing about all the time in order to, I think, really wake up to the severity of these issues. And any way that we can reach people, we should. And that means, long things and short things. It means lots of facts and data, and it also means lots of stories and narratives and characters. It means, reading an op-ed by Bill McKibben or an article by Sabrina Shankman and David Abel in the Boston Globe. And it also means reading the editorials in the pages of Yes Magazine or Jacobin Magazine. I think that there needs to be a sort of really healthy ecosystem in order for us to get anywhere in climate media.
Okay, that's great. So I think I can switch it over to Joy now, who's going to field some questions from our live audience. So Joy, if you've got any questions there for Dharna.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the audience, feel free to keep typing in the little chats in the little module there, and I will try to answer them as we go. All right, so first question. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but well, why don't we just reiterate it a little bit? The Globe often seems to take a pro-business, pro-growth, almost boosterish agenda. Do you find a conflict with trying to report seriously on climate issues in ways that might conflict with the Globe's agenda?
I mean, I have to say, like, I haven't been at the Globe for very long, but the mandate that we have at Into the Red, the climate section that I was sort of there for the launch of, is pretty squarely in line, I think, with what the climate crisis demands. I mean, it's a section of the paper that's so heavily focused on accountability, more work to be done on justice, of course, but there's been a focus on justice, a focus on sort of uplifting all kinds of solutions. Not to say that I think that we need to like put all of our focus onto technological solutions, but I do think, quite frankly, that we do need to spend some time looking at burgeoning technologies, along with sort of everything else. So the answer for me is no. Does that mean that I think that the globe doesn't have more work to do in order to sort of take on this problem with the scale that it deserves? Absolutely. But I think that everyone, frankly, has more work to do. Yes, I think, of course, especially the sort of major newspapers bear even more responsibility. Bigger institutions always bear a greater responsibility. But you know, I would love to talk more if you wanna contact me about specific instances. Yeah, always happy to chat further.
Awesome. All right, next question we have here. This is a bit of an EJ distributive justice kind of question. Do you think the future expansion of offshore wind energy may create a disparity between Green New Deal plans for coastal regions versus inland regions?
I mean, the basic answer to this is that I think that without careful attention to justice, anything can create injustice. And so I do think that it's possible. I don't think that there's any reason that offshore wind should not be beneficial to inland regions, though. I mean, I think that you asked earlier, Noel, about things that are undercovered. I think that we simply need more coverage in media about the need for transmission. You know, having the big flashy energy project is one thing. Distributing that energy to all kinds of people in all kinds of regions is another thing. So no, I certainly don't think that it has to, but also we need distributed energy and we need energy from all kinds of sources if we're going to get off of fossil fuels. And that means that, yes, some people are going to have a grid that's powered by offshore wind. Sometimes people are going to have a grid that's powered by solar, or, you know, some people are going to be running their, you know, homes off of it maybe hydropower or geothermal. There's lots of different kinds of energy that we're going to need. But the main question is how we are getting it to people from the power plants, from the wind farms, from the solar panels, et cetera. And so, yes, I think, yes, of course it could, but there's no reason it has to.
Awesome. All right, I have some questions here that I wrote. So for journalism students who will watch this, and myself, what was your journey breaking into climate journalism, and what advice do you have for aspiring climate journalists?
My journey into climate journalism, I think, was sort of unorthodox, but I think that that's actually the case for a lot of climate journalists. So I started working in media shortly after college, mostly just because I wanted to work at an organization that aligned with my values. I didn't really care about being a journalist. I cared about not having an evil boss who I hated, honestly. So I found myself working at the Real News Network in a sort of general producer role. And there I was covering and doing research on and doing interviews on everything from like economic justice in Cuba to like gender justice here in the United States, you know, abortion and food stamps and every kind of sort of justice oriented issue I wanted to cover, and started realizing really quickly that everything that I cared about so deeply was deeply affected by climate change and vice versa. You know, this was around the time, for instance, that there was a US-led invasion of Syria. And I found myself so frustrated that there was so little coverage of the ways that the climate crisis was exacerbating these issues. You know, I would do stories on the sort of military industrial complex and find myself, again, frustrated that so few people were writing about the ways that the military fuels climate change, the way that the Pentagon fuels climate change, and that other countries' militaries do too. And that, I think that is sort of how I found myself onto the climate beat. It wasn't really that I found myself to be such a like granola crunchy hippie or something like this, although not that that's so far from it. But it was really just that I found that climate change was such a deep existential threat and one that was going to exacerbate so many issues that I already cared about. And so, I mean, I guess my advice would just be like, if you want to be a journalist and you care about society, frankly, the climate beat is a beat for you. I mean, if you want to do accountability stories, come to the climate beat. If you want to do culture stories, come to the climate beat. There are so many movies and TV shows and you know, books and everything that are about climate change today. The climate beat is a beat for every different kind of story. And so, yeah, it can be daunting, but like, hit me up if I can ever help.
I will. All right, here we have another question in the chat. Massachusetts economy is so dependent on the military industry. Can the Globe report on the relationship of this to climate issues?
Yeah, one of the first actually pieces that I got to do at the Boston Globe was a story about how the military fuels climate change and how there's been so many exemptions made for the military in climate policies, dating back decades, but continuing today in the Biden administration. And yes, I mean, I think that the fact that Massachusetts, the economy is so deeply entwined with this, I mean, the home to companies like Raytheon can pose some pretty serious problems. And not only like the military industrial complex. I mean, we're seeing, I think, similar sort of questions crop up with the burgeoning cryptocurrency industry and others. But I think that the reason that the military kind of plays such an important and understudied role in this is because so frequently we're taught to think of climate change as a national security issue, not a safety issue. So often climate policy has been a reason to just give more money to the Pentagon and to the Pentagon's contractors. And I hope, yes, that we can shed light on that. Again, if you want to talk, feel free to hit me up.
I had a guy one time in a class try to convince me that Raytheon was a really sustainable company because they made the most fuel efficient jet engine in the world. And I was like, well, I think that misses the point. But yeah, definitely good to keep exposing things like this, especially in a state like Massachusetts that relies so heavily on these industries. All right, here's another question. As journalism moves more and more into newsletters, Substack, podcasts, and other non-traditional mediums, do you think these mediums are as effective or maybe even more effective than standard verticals for getting out climate messages?
There are two different ways to answer this. I think that any kind of medium that can get people to watch and can be a vehicle for truth is a good one. And so I think that there are people in new media who are doing work that is as important in the climate space as the folks who cover these issues in the sort of newspapers of traditional media and things like this. That said, the thing that does worry me is that because these are burgeoning industries, right? Media is right now largely an industry. I get nervous about the ways that this can open room for less regulation. A good example of this that I mentioned earlier is that there are fewer rules and regulations for the kinds of advertising that can be done on podcasts. And I think that that can open the way for lots of kind of dangerous fossil fuel messaging that might not meet the standards of older media platforms. And so, I mean, I think that with any sort of new innovation, there are questions that have to be asked about how to ensure that they are properly regulated and, are honest and accountable. So, but yes, I mean, I listen to podcasts all the time and I read tons of newsletters, and there's people doing great work in all of these spaces.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you brought up regulation because I think about that every time I see those obnoxious like ExxonMobil algae biofuel ads that seem to go everywhere from like TikTok to podcasts. All right, here is another question. How can we learn more about the power of the lobbyists in the legislature and in the executive offices in Massachusetts as well as in DC? So what kind of sources of information would you recommend for citizens to use to educate themselves?
I mean, to learn more about the lobbyists, I think, honestly, I want to say that you should read the reporting on this issue, but in order to do that, there also needs to be more of it. So part of how I think you should learn more is to reach out to journalists who you want to hear covering these things and just say like, hey, here's what you should be covering. I mean, in order to stay sort of up to date, though, on what you need to know in terms of your sort of state and federal, the influence of some of your state and federal lobbyists, there's some really important resources. Open Secrets is one, Influence Map is another. There's sort of watchdogs that are keeping tabs on the influence that these kinds of bodies can have. So those are two places to start looking, and there's plenty of others.
Awesome. All right, how about, who are your favorite climate journalists? I can assume Amy Westervelt because of Drill, but who else?
I mean, this is such a hard question because there's so many different people who are doing such good work in the realm of both journalism and sort of other kinds of climate writing. You know, in terms of sort of larger media platforms, I think one person who's really worth reading and getting familiar with is Alex Kaufman at the Huffington Post. If, you know, I've heard a lot of interest in sort of bringing, you know, a sort of more realistic perspectives to bigger media outlets. And I think that he's really done that job there. And that's a pretty important place to look. I also read tons of smaller and sort of independent media outlets, and love the work of, you know, folks like Kate Aronoff at the New Republic, who wrote a really incredible book last year that I'd recommend everyone reads. There's sort of regional publications, publications like Southerly and Scalawag that focus on the South. You know, in terms of sort of other essays and other forms of media, Mary Hegler, who hosts another podcast with Amy Westervelt, has done really important work. And then I hate to just plug like this, but I would be really, it would be wrong of me to not just say also that like there's bigger papers who are doing really incredible work in this space too. You know, whether that's some of the sort of climate solutions reporting that's done in places like the Post, or the new vertical that we've just launched at the Boston Globe, where folks like Sabrina Shankman are, I think, doing a lot to hold bodies like the governor's office and utilities accountable for the climate plans they said they would implement, are really important. But I feel honestly like I could just answer this question for like 2 hours. So I'll stop there, but there's lots of folks doing really good work.
Awesome. I know I love Hot Take with Mary Heglar and Amy. Such a hilarious podcast.
For sure.
All right, here's kind of an overview question. What makes good versus bad climate journalism? I know that's kind of general, but what are like the top things, the top criteria you try to accomplish when writing?
One thing that I think is helpful to remember is that you can strike a balance. You can not lie to people about the urgency of these issues, but also not fall into unnecessary doomerism. It is not good journalism to pretend that the climate crisis is not dire. It's not good journalism to pretend that the climate crisis is something we don't have to worry about yet, something that is for next year, not to worry about now. It's not good climate journalism also to fall into this sort of trap of doom and gloom and not allow people to remember that there are still things that we can do right now that will dramatically slow climate change and frankly save many, many people's lives. I think that also bad journalism falls into the tropes of like blank or nothing. You know, I think that it doesn't help that bodies like the IPCC, for good reason, focus on numbers like 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. 1.5 degrees Celsius is a really important target, one that if we cross, we will see catastrophic levels of warming. But that doesn't mean that 1.39 is going to be great. And it doesn't mean that 1.51 is going to be catastrophically worse than 1.5, right? These are just benchmarks. They are not themselves the goal. And so I think that something that's really important is to remember that journalism as a vehicle for these kinds of facts needs to keep in mind what's underneath these facts. 1.5 is both a really, really important measure and also a really arbitrary one. And also, I think, you know, bad climate journalism is boring and not engaging and poorly written and doesn't make anyone want to read it. Good climate journalism often focuses on people, is engaging, and makes people want to come back for more. You can shake people up and really move people without making it so that people just want to like crawl into a hole and never come out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of Emily Eck and Heated when I think of that type of climate journalism that's both realistic but also kind of punky and irreverent. So it gets people, you know, coming back for more.
Absolutely.
Professor Healy, I will pass it off to you now that we're sort of coming to the end.
Yeah, so just one last kind of related question. You know, professors and general members of the public often would like to write op-eds and, you know, submit them to major newspapers. But as we all know, getting op-eds placed is quite challenging, you know, for various reasons. Either your writing isn't up to scratch or the message doesn't resonate with the editors. Have you got any kind of general tips for, you know, members of the public or Salem State community in writing op-eds and you know, how to go about that?
Know what your hook is before you even pitch the story. I think is a really important one. In some ways, I hate giving this advice to people because there shouldn't have to be a hook for climate change. There's always some horrible climate impact happening in many different places at the same time. At any point in time, there are like 5 million hooks. And so in some ways, you should just be able to say, hey, I have something to say about climate change. But realistically, that is not the thing that people are going to read then. And so it is not the thing that people are going to commission you to write. So I think it's really important to stay on top of the news, stay on top of the current conversation. And often the way into that is not just, you know, looking at climate disasters, but is looking at other kinds of climate events and being able to tie them to the climate crisis, because every story in this day and age is a climate story. You know, I think we've seen really great examples of this recently, where many people are tying the current war in Ukraine and then this kind of ensuing energy crisis to the need for a just transition to green energy. I think that looking outside of things that kind of squarely fall within the climate beat, so to speak, and thinking about climate change a little bit more broadly can be a really important way to think through, you know, what you're going to write. I guess honestly, some other things are just like, don't say too much, and make sure that you know exactly what the point that you want to make is before you start writing. I'm saying this not only to all of y'all, but also to myself. I think that sometimes the most successful stories are the ones where you can just say, I need this many words to make this one point, and like there are 5 other points I could make along the way, but instead I'm just going to focus on saying this one thing and saying it really well. So getting clear on exactly what it is that you're trying to say before you start writing, I think is a pretty good way to approach, I think, something like an op-ed or an article.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay, thanks so much, Dharna. So I've got some notifications on upcoming events at Salem State. I'll just briefly mention. So we've between April 11th and 22nd, we have climate mini golf course on the library quad. Thursday, tomorrow, we have the Friend of the Earth's Award, which will be presented to Heath and to Boston University professor Nathan Phillips. We also on Friday have the role of museums in the climate crisis with the PVD Essex Museum curator Jane Winchell. And then on Thursday next week, we have a session with Tara Gallagher on addressing climate change on Salem State's campus and why it matters. Okay, so if folks are interested in other climate events, we've got a lot going on at Salem State. I would like to again thank you, Dharna, for your time. It was a really great conversation. Thank you, Joey. Hope everyone has a nice evening, and we hope to see you all again soon. Okay, that's it.
So much for having me. Really appreciate it. And thanks for all of your work, Noel. And thank you, Joey, as well.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Good night, everyone.